Hi, and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, I got some movie documentary recommendations for you. I love movie documentaries. I never come away from a movie documentary that's any good being less educated about film. There are a number of bad ones out there. I'm not going to say what they are, but most of them are on Tubi at the moment. But there are a number of good ones that informed how I look at film. And I love them. I can eat them like popcorn. So I thought I would get 11 of them together that I really like and that I've got on the shelves so I can do a bit of show and tell. And just recommend 11 movie documentaries for you. We'll start out with one of the GOATs. Directed by Richard LaGravenese and Ted Demme, A Decade Under the Influence. The 70s films that changed the world. It's got Altman, Bogdanovich, Coppola, Eastwood, Friedkin, Hopper, Pollock, Scorsese, and more. It's a documentary about how American cinema changed in the 1970s because of these outliers, these film school brats and other people who came along and changed how film was done in America. And there are interviews with the directors themselves. There are film clips. There are a couple of extras on here. The DVD special features are additional interviews with Robert Altman, Francis Ford Coppola, Peter Bogdanovich, Sidney Lumet, Roy Scheider, and others, and some filmmaker bios. This edition is from Umbrella, who really lean into the documentaries in some of the stuff they put out. And this is an essential film. It's one of those ones where if you're not that familiar with the 1970s in American cinema, you're going to sit down with a pen and paper and just write down the names of the films madly while you're watching the documentary. Pause, rewind the bit you missed, and continue watching it. It really is one of the great documentaries about American cinema, and highly recommended, and a good place to start if you're getting into cinema documentaries. This one, directed by Mike Malloy, covers some really interesting cinema. It's a thing called Eurocrime, the Italian cop and gangster films that ruled the 1970s. So we're on a theme here with the 1970s. Franco Nero, John Saxon, Henry Silva, Antonio Sabato, Fred Williamson, Luca Moretta, Joseph D'Alessandro, Chris Mitchum. It's basically a doco about Italian police and crime movies of the 1970s, which were mad films. The car chases were crazy. The stunt people were even crazier. They're almost as crazy as Australian stunt people in the 1970s. On the back there, you've got a picture of Mario Adolf. It's a great documentary, and it covers a lot of ground on the Italian crime scene, a lot of which was filmed in and around Milan, which was a crime hotspot in the 1970s. The mafia was really big then and there in Milan, and so you get a lot of these films set and filmed in Milan. And again, it's one of those ones where you're going to sit down with a pen and paper, write down the movie titles and who directed them, all that kind of thing, so you can find them later on to watch. There's a good chunk of Fernando de Leo, for instance, on this one. And Fernando de Leo's crime movies of the time were extraordinarily good. Things like The Italian Connection, highly recommended. Great stuff. If you're into crime movies and violence, you're going to like Eurocrime. And you should have it in your collection, or at least find it somewhere streaming so you can watch and enjoy it. The next documentary I got for you is a bit controversial. It's from Eureka, and it's about the films that were made in Germany during the 1930s and 1940s when the Nazis ruled. And it's called Hitler's Hollywood. And it makes the argument for the fact that, leaving aside all the politics, and there was definitely political influence on filmmaking, there were some really interesting films that were made during the reign of the Nazis in Germany, which isn't to wave a flag for them, but it's just to acknowledge the history of. For instance, one of the best versions of the Titanic was done by German filmmakers during that period. And the documentary also talks about the people who left German cinema to avoid working for the Nazis. There's a lot of Goebbels in there, and Goebbels' influence on it, and how he used the German film industry as a way of, first off, finding girlfriends, and secondly, as a propaganda arm for the government. In some ways, it's a cautionary tale about political influence on cinema, but it's also a way of going, yes, there were some really interesting films made in the 1930s and the 1940s by those bunch of murderous bastards. It's a good documentary. It doesn't speak in favor of the regime at all, but it acknowledges the cinematic history that happened when they got power. UFA, for instance, the main German film company, had been hitting hard since the early 1920s, and how that was changed by working under that regime. Very interesting documentary. And this one you get on DVD and Blu-ray both. So you've got both formats. Like I said, controversial. But again, it is a part of cinema history. And so it's therefore a worthwhile subject for a documentary to be made. This one's a passion project from Andrew Leovold, an Australian filmmaker who ran a video store in Brisbane for a very long time, and is now making documentaries as his core business and his passion. He's currently working on doing documentaries about the African film industries, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. But this one was about a 2'9" Filipino James Bond, a guy called Weng, who was a very short-statured guy, as you can see. Andrew Leovold had a passion for the movies and the oeuvre of Weng, and so he made the search for Weng. He's tough, he's tender, he's 3 feet small. And I have a lot of clips from the films that this very short guy who had a particular kind of dwarfism, not only was he short of stature, but the genetic side of it was something where his intellectual capacity wasn't that of an adult human being, even though in other ways, physically, apart from the stature, he was an adult human being. So there's a lot of interviews with people who knew Weng. There's a lot of clips there. And this is one of those strange little passion projects that certain people make when they get on to a bandwagon of just being fascinated with a particular moment in cinema and a particular person who was part of that moment. This one was released by Monster Pictures, and it's got 2 discs plus the original soundtrack for the movie. And Andrew self-funds a lot of this stuff and crowdfunds a lot of his work. And he's an interesting filmmaker who has just this mad passion for edge cinema. And this is a good documentary about one tiny aspect of cinema that isn't in the mainstream. It's not English language cinema. It's not Chinese. It's not Russian. It's part of the developing world cinema. And Andrew does a lovely job of sharing his passion for Weng and just showing us that cinema from other countries has something to teach us about the weirdness of human experience. While we're on the subject of Australian filmmakers, this one's a documentary about David Stratton, the guy who's the preeminent film critic here in Australia at the moment and has been since the 1970s. He's written 4 books about it. I've actually got his latest book to read, which is about 21st century Australian cinema. And that one I recommend as well. But there are 2 documentaries on this disc. One is David Stratton, A Cinematic Life, about his life and how he changed Australia's film industry. He migrated from England in the 1960s. He was seminal in starting the Sydney Film Festival and in fighting censorship of films that were shown in film festivals. He later went on to have a long career as an academic and as a TV presenter about cinema, working for a long time with Margaret Pomerantz in a series they did together on a couple of different networks. He's iconic in Australian cinema. He's now in his 80s and his vision's starting to fail. But he has finished a book and he's still passionate about cinema. So there is David Stratton, A Cinematic Life, about him, a biographical thing. And David Stratton's Stories of Australian Cinema, which is about the history of Australian cinema. If you're more curious about Australian cinema, this isn't a bad place to start. And people do ask me, where do I start in finding out about Australian cinema? A lot of it isn't in books, and if it is in books, particularly David Stratton's 3 books, The Last New Wave, The Avocado Plantation, and his new one, the name of which I forgot, but I'll put up a picture here. Very good place to start, but they are expensive to get. The Avocado Plantation is going for mad money at the moment. That's the one that covered the 1980s and 1990s in Australian cinema. And The Last New Wave covered the Ausploitation era in documentary detail. They're a recommendation. If you can find that, you're off to a good start. Then we're going to move on to an Australian movie star. In fact, one of the first great Australian movie stars. Rod Taylor, Pulling No Punches. This one came out for Umbrella. It's a documentary by Robert DeYoung about Rod Taylor and his history as a film and television actor. Lots of videos of people: Maggie Smith, Angela Lansbury, Tippi Hedren, Veronica Cartwright, Baz Luhrmann, you can skip that bit, Keith Michelle, Jack Thompson, Susie Porter, Brian Brown, Bill Collins, Stephen Vagg, and Rod Taylor. Really great documentary about Rod Taylor. Interesting guy. Unfortunately, like so many actors of his time, he was affected by alcohol and that diminished the end of his career. But for a very long time, he was our film star here in Australia, particularly in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And every Rod Taylor movie that was made would get a cinematic release in Australia because it was a Rod Taylor movie. And it's good to see they've got a documentary here just acknowledging him and his range as an actor. For a guy who was basically a beefcake-looking guy, he could play all sorts of different roles. He could do comedy, he could do drama, he could do passionate romanticism, he could do outrageous characters later in his career. And it's good to see that there's a decent documentary and on physical media about Rod Taylor. While we are on the subject of Australian cinema, this is pretty much the Bible of Australian exploitation. Mark Hartley's Not Quite Hollywood. This one you've got to have in your collection if you're interested in exploitation cinema. It's got everything you'll need. And again, this is one where you're going to need your notebook. Tons of great stuff about Australian cinema. There are a lot of extras on this. And it goes from that early 1970s when we had the change of government and Labor got in after 23 years of Conservative government, and Australian cultural pursuits were encouraged and financed to a certain extent by the government. And this covers that mad era when all sorts of movies, there were titillating sex comedies being made, there were dramas, there was things like Mad Max, there were crazy action films all over the place. Australian cinema just went nuts. There was another side of Australian cinema when they were doing lyrical dramas about the Australian colonial experience in a positive way and things like that. And also then Fred Skepsey came along and threw a brick in the water with the Chan and Jimmy Blacksmith. But there's tons of them there. There's the back of it. There is a companion booklet that came out as well, written by Paul Harris, which covered a lot more information than just the movie. But there is the slipcover. I can't show you the back of that because let me try this. That's why I can't show you the back of this. But it's on 2 discs. Bruce Spence in stalk there. And what else have we got? I got to be careful showing this. And some stuff from Alvin Purple. This is the go-to documentary for exploitation. It's not to be underestimated. They've got tons of interviews with the people who made the movies. There's an interview with Tarantino as well about his love for exploitation cinema. But Not Quite Hollywood, you need to have a copy of, and it is your go-to for exploitation. Then we've got Mark Hartley's next documentary about the Roger Corman films that were made in the Philippines in the 70s. Machete, Maidens Unleashed, which is all about those exploitation films that were made by Corman in the Philippines under Marcos. Things like The Big Birdcage and all of those films, and how mad an experience it was for them to make it there with the full cooperation of the Marcos government and the Filipino military. Really great documentary. A lot of actresses talk about it. A lot of the people who were in the films and made the films talk about it there. There are 2 discs on this, one of which has tons of special features as well as the documentary. And a second disc is one of the movies that was talked about in the documentary, The Mothers. So Machete, Maidens Unleashed, groovy 1970s exploitation cinema, talked about with loving care. Tons of extras. There's a Q&A with Roger Corman and his daughter Julie. The Filipino revolution that even Marcos couldn't crush, it says. Great doco. And if, like me, you grew up watching these films in the cinema and later on VHS and eventually DVD, great doco to have. Then we got Mark Hartley's third documentary about Cannon films and the mad movies that were made in the 1980s by Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. Electric Boogaloo, the history of Cannon films. There it is on the back, all those really bad Chuck Norris movies. And no, that's a bit of an oxymoron to say that. And all of the later Charles Bronson things like Death Wish and all those films. And Masters of the Universe and movies with people like Michael Dudikoff in them, and Robert Forster and Franco Nero and Dolph Lundgren and Bo Derek. All of those films are covered in this one. The documentary runs 106 minutes, has tons of interviews in it. And a lot of people I know are more in love with the Cannon films than I am. And even though I enjoyed the documentary, there are a lot of them that I've seen, and I've seen most of the films, but they're not particularly my kind of films. I think there was a split there where a lot of people like the kind of films, but for me, I like Charles Band's films and Empire Pictures and all that kind of stuff, which often was more fantastical than the stuff that Cannon was putting out. So I'm on that side of the fence. But still, having a documentary about Cannon films is well worthwhile. That brings me down to the last two, and the guy who made these documentaries just had a birthday. He's 82, 83, something like that. Martin Scorsese. And there are two documentaries. Martin Scorsese presents Val Lewton, The Man in the Shadows, which was written and directed by Ken Jones, but it's under the banner of Martin Scorsese, about all of those fantastic movies made by Val Lewton for RKO Studios in the 1940s. It's a good overview of things like The Cat People, The Seventh Victim, Body Snatchers, I Walked with a Zombie in those films. And it's good to have that in my collection as well. I've got the movies themselves, but the documentary really gives you the context under which they were made, and how after Citizen Kane almost bankrupted RKO Studios, Val Lewton's second unit people, with people like Jacques Tourneur, basically saved the studio for a time by putting out low-budget horror films that really hit with audiences and became iconic in the genre ever since. So there's that. The second one is one of two other documentaries that Scorsese did. He did one about Italian post-war cinema, which I also recommend. But this one is about American cinema, and it's a personal journey with Martin Scorsese through American cinema. This one is probably the one that I learnt the most from out of all these documentaries. I sat down with my pen and my notepad and followed through on things. It introduced me to movies like 40 Guns and the original Roadhouse, and a lot of the crime movies from the 1950s, and Bud Bedica's movies like Ride Lonesome. All that stuff gets a lot of love in this particular set of documentaries. There are different chapters. There's the director's dilemma, mastering the creative process, the director as storyteller, the director as illusionist, the director as smuggler, and the director as iconoclast. It's a masterclass in appreciation of 20th century American cinema. And I can rewatch this every couple of years, and even though I'm fairly familiar with the documentary, I still learn little bits of extra stuff watching it, because Scorsese is a good storyteller, and the documentary is made really well. And this one is one you should definitely check out, and by whatever means, keep a copy of. Really, the best of the best. So that's what I got for you this time. Documentaries I recommend, and there are going to be more of them in future. Documentaries about cinema are probably my university. I love them. I love the fact that people keep showing me new movies in these documentaries that I didn't know about. And over the last 20 years particularly, I've learned a lot about movies watching documentaries like these, and the way that the people making the documentaries see film and the techniques and the filters they use to evaluate film have informed the way I evaluate film, and I can never thank them enough for that. Passing on knowledge about cinema is what I do, but it's also something that I've been given by people who preceded me, and hopefully I give to people who will follow me. Storytelling is such an important thing for human beings, and trying to find truth in storytelling is, I think, over the next decades going to be very important. And it's something that we should appreciate, and it's something that we should protect. But all these documentaries make us custodians of that truth and remind us that we should protect storytelling from people who will use it for nefarious purposes, like in Hitler's Hollywood. But also, we should remember the good things of the past and not just dismiss them because they are of the past. So that's what I got for you this time around. 11 documentaries you should definitely check out. You'll have a wonderful 26 hours watching all those documentaries. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can donate to the channel through the YouTube app. You can also donate by becoming a channel member or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/terrytalksmovies. Next up, I've got Science Fiction Saturday, and I've got a couple of newer science fiction movies that should satisfy everybody, whether you like old science fiction or new science fiction. These ones hit pretty hard and remind us that science fiction cinema isn't just about pew pew zoom zoom, but it can be about much more than that. So until all of that happens, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some documentaries, and I'll catch you next time.